Alright, last one for the immune system. So hopefully you've survived the first four, because this is one of the more complex systems to talk about, for many reasons, as you're probably learning. However, we're at the end, and essentially in the first four of these video lectures, that's the key information that I want you to take away from this. The last part I'm going to talk about now is hypersensitivity. Now, hypersensitivity comes out of the specific immune response, and predominantly from the humorally mediated specific immune response. So from that point of view, I want to just make you aware of the types of hypersensitivity response that we can actually elicit. Most of us, when we think about hypersensitivity reactions in our immune system, we think about allergy and allergic reactions such as, snuffly nose, lots of mucus, lots of eye watering, things like that. Or we may think of asthma, which is a constriction of the bronchioles, etc., making a wheezing sound, difficult to get breath. And both of these are part of hypersensitivity, but they're part of only one type. So I want to look at the four types and just very briefly talk about the importance of each one and how they differ from each other. Okay, so again, behind me I've got the four types, type 1, 2, 3 and 4. They're no more complex than that. The type 1 is the one that you probably know the most about right now, and that is the acute hypersensitivity. Now, in acute hypersensitivity, this is driven mainly by the action of things like IgE. If you remember, IgE is the one that attracted the eosinophils, is functioning in the respiratory and digestive systems, and it attaches onto mast cells and basophils. Both of these cell types release histamine. So you're going to get an inflammatory response going from the histamine, you're going to get vasodilation going, you're going to get lots of the hay fever-like symptoms. So this immediate response is responsible for asthma, if it's an inhaled antigen, and allergies such as hives, etc., are also these edematous swellings, are also a response, immediate response to something which is irritating the immune system. Why is this all important? Well, because of this process here called anaphylaxis. An anaphylaxis response is a massive response to a particular allergen. Now notice I say they're allergen as opposed to antigen. An antigen is something an antibody attaches to. An allergen can trigger these allergic-like responses by triggering more than just the antigen itself. But so what happens in an anaphylaxis? Well, like asthma, you get a bronchial constriction. That can lead to dyspnea, which is a difficulty in breathing, but it also, because of this system here, relates to vasodilation, with difficulty breathing, with a drop in blood pressure because your blood vessels have all just opened up. That can lead to shock, lack of blood flow. It can also cause swelling in the upper part of the throat, in the oro and laryngo and nasopharyngeal area, and that can actually close the airway off completely because of this swelling due to this vasodilation going on, the leakiness of the fluid and the inflammatory response. So obviously anyone, for example, with a peanut allergy is a very common one, has to be very careful of what they're exposed to. The caveat to this is that you have to have had a prior exposure. You have to have raised the antibodies. Remember, we go back to the primary and the secondary response. Well, in the primary, the first time you're exposed to, say, a peanut, you develop the antibodies and then you form memory of those antibodies. So if you ever come across a peanut again, you're going to over-respond to it by a massive production of those particular antibodies, and massive level of histamine being released, vasodilation, lots of constriction in the lungs, etc., tightening of the throat, swelling of the tongue, all of those inner structures swelling and then basically closing the throat. How do we prevent this? We prevent it through EpiPens, which are filled with 500 milligrams of epinephrine, which is something we call in Britain adrenaline. This is going to do the opposite to vasodilate. It's going to vasoconstrict. It's going to try and work against all of these huge changes taking place in the body. So this is the one that we know best. It's an acute hypersensitivity, meaning that it happens immediately once you've been exposed before, and it's what typically gives us our allergies, the most common childhood illness and asthma, which so many people grow out of, but for some people that can also lead to anaphylaxis. So type 2. Well, type 2 hypersensitivity is an antibody dependent cytotoxic reaction, so it's slightly different, because in this case it's an IgM or an got IgM there twice. That's clever. IgM or IgG binding, and it binds to the antigen, like as we saw in your last video lecture. It binds to the antigen, but it can also bind to a cell receptor on the surface. But in both ways, because remember, IgM and IgG, we just draw this on the side, here's our IgM or IgG antibody. Remember that these things are complement binding sites. And remember, complement's the protein that's already in the blood. So once this is stimulated and it binds, it can activate complement. So once it's bound to the cell, once it binds on, say like that, it can activate complement to actually punch a hole in the side of that target cell. So it's a cytotoxic because of the antibody binding it and causing the complement then to create a hole in the cell it's bound to. So that's a type 2 antibody-dependent cytotoxic reaction. Don't get the cytotoxic confused with the cytotoxic T cell. It's done by an antibody using complement. Type 3 is an immune complex. Now, immune complexes are between the antigen and the antibody, so when they're bound up and clumping, agglutinating. This can cause a massive increase in inflammation throughout the blood system. And things like lupus, for example, systemic lupus erythematosus is a very good example of that, because you're getting antigen-antibody complexes running throughout the blood and creating inflammation in particular organ systems. So lupus can actually be different for individuals that suffer from it because it affects one organ system more than the other. But this is a type 3 hypersensitive response. Finally, we have type 4, which is called the delayed response. Type 1, the allergy, is an acute or immediate. This is now a delayed response. It takes 12 to 72 hours to build up. And this is down to antigen presenting cells mediating the response. So they're in the lymph nodes and they're presenting the antigen to, in this case I've written here haptens to remind myself to mention haptens. Haptens are just things on a foreign cell or virus, etc., which can elicit an antibody response. So this antigen or hapten has stimulated an APC mediated response to it. And so common things, poison ivy does it this way. So when you're exposed to poison ivy, it can be 12 hours or longer before you actually start getting the itches and everything. And that's one of the real problems with poison ivy, because you've been exposed to it out in the field, you've come home, you may have had a shower that evening, and you haven't washed all the oil off, so it's moved the oil around different parts of your body. Now you've got itching going on everywhere, which is just really unpleasant. The TB skin test works on the same basis. Cheap metals is probably the one you're most probably interested in. A lot of people have a delayed hypersensitivity response to nickel, for example, and other metals used in jewellery, whether it be on a watch, or whether it be earrings, or a necklace, or a bracelet, or a ring, something like that. So my wife and my kids are all like that. So the only jewellery that they can wear is either pure gold or pure silver. So rather expensive at birthdays and Christmases. However, it stops them having this type 4 delayed hypersensitivity response, so it's worth it. And they are worth it. So that's the end of the immune system. I hope this has made some sense to you. It's a difficult system to understand. I appreciate that. Do the best that you can. And email me with any questions that you have about it. Thank you for listening.